Hi, Story with Tate in the studio. Welcome back to another episode. And in today's video, I will be showing you how I built this modern farmhouse dining table. Now, it's made out of white oak and I'm using 8/4 material. Now, what 8/4 means is basically a fraction. So it's essentially 2 inches. So the rough lumber starts off with 2 inch, and here I'm just cutting the leg pieces. And once I cut all those leg pieces, I am moving over to the jointer here. So what the jointer does is it just flattens the one face and then the edge on that board. And then once I flatten that edge out, I'm actually just doing the leg connection pieces. Now these legs are about 3.5 inches thick, so I did need to glue these boards together for both the vertical leg pieces and also the horizontal pieces, which are called stretchers. So those stretchers connect the vertical legs to each other. After I've glued up those legs, I'm just cutting them on the miter saw here. So these are the leg pieces again, and I'm cutting them all to the same length. So once I've done that, you can see I'm just sort of mocking it up here and arranging the boards so that I'll know where to put the dominoes. Now what the domino is it's a machine that cuts some grooves into the wood, and you can see it just there, sort of those little holes there. And there's something that you put in there, they're called tenons, and you just put those in and it connects the leg pieces. Now the customer did request to have the table sort of distressed. So I'm just using an angle grinder with a wire wheel here, and I'm just sort of slowly working it in. And what that does is it takes out the softer part of the wood so that it's got a textured appearance. Sometimes people call it wire brushing. Now after I've done that, I just use my router and I just smooth over the edges. And then again, I'm going back over it with the sandpaper, and what that does is just smooths out sort of those rough edges. Now after those leg pieces have been glued together, I'm using my domino again just to cut the slots in where the stretchers will go. Now those stretcher pieces, I think they came in at about 6 feet, because on each end of the tabletop overlaps 12 inches on each end and 8 inches along the edge. Now the customer, she also did request I put some details in it, so I'm just using the router there. Now in hindsight, I think using the router ahead of time would have been a much better choice than doing it once the legs were assembled. It just made it much simpler. But here you can see I'm starting to glue all of the leg assembly together. So I'm just putting lots of glue in those holes, and I'm just using my little brush here. And I am just spreading that glue out so it's got a nice even bond. And so I'm just banging the skirts in. The skirts is actually the piece that is just right underneath the table that connects the legs together. But the stretcher is the piece that connects the lower end. So yeah, it's just the terminology. But anyways, I'm just applying all the glue here and taking my time to just really make sure that it stays concentrated right in where those tenons are. Those tenons are the pieces of wood that connect the legs together. Now I'm just applying the glue there, like I said, and just you can see it's kind of a slow process sort of putting it in. I'm sort of setting it up on one edge and kind of banging it in, and I did want to do it on this bench just so that I had full support the whole way. I had to slide 2 of my workbenches together. And being that it is quite a long base, I needed to double up on my clamps just in order to tighten it. And once I did tighten those up, I just went back with the tape measure and made sure it was all square and that the distance between everything was all equal. So it turned out really good, but yeah, I just tighten those clamps and it pulls it all together, and I use a baby wipe just to take out all that excess glue. So after those legs are all glued up, I just move to the tabletop. Now the boards, I'm just cutting off the end pieces there, and I just bring that board over to the jointer. You can see the dogs are kind of hanging around there. And anyways, I do the face, and now I'm just doing the edge. Now that board had quite a bit of a bow to it, so I had to take off the back end. I had to run it through the jointer a few times just to trim it down so that I could get a nice flat edge. But once I do that, it just sort of grooves it out and takes off the edge, and it ends up being nice and square by the time it was all said and done. Running it through the planer and flattening all those boards, I think the final thickness I came at was about 1 5/8 inches when it was all said and done. And lastly, once all those boards are jointed and planed, I take them off, the final edge off on the table saw. And here you can see I'm just taking all the tabletop pieces and just arranging them to try to find what's most visually appealing. So after I do that, I'm using my domino again just to cut slots into the edge of the board that are going on the tabletop. Now the reason I do this is that once I put those slots in, they'll be nice and even when I glue up that tabletop. And because if you don't put those in, what happens is as those boards are tightened on the clamps, they have a tendency to sort of slip up and down because that glue is slippery. Those dominoes and tendons just keep it in place. But after I've glued it all up and the clamps come off, I'm just using the track saw to take off the one end. And after that's done, now I go to the distressing the top part of the table there. So this takes quite a bit of time and makes a bit of a mess. But after I've done that, I go back over it with 120 grit and just take off the rough edges. Now you can feel that texture, but it is still fairly smooth to the touch. So after that's done, I can move on to the breadboard ends. Now the way I'm attaching the breadboard ends, again, is with the domino. So I'm just cutting those slots, and I do it on the breadboard end as well. So those breadboards, they will expand and contract at a different rate than the boards that are going along the length of the table. So when I do that, when I cut the slots on those dominoes on the breadboard end piece, they are actually loose, and what they do is they float within that groove so that when those boards do expand and contract, they won't crack or separate the boards. And basically I'm just clamping them up, and the breadboards, I leave them a little hanging over so that I can come back after the fact with the track saw and just cut it off. But here what I'm doing now is I'm just drilling those holes for the pins, and so what I'll do is put some dowels or some dowels just right into there, and I just glue that top portion of it so that it keeps the dowel into the top of the breadboard, but it's not glued into the tenon. So what that does again is it allows that board or all the boards to expand and contract at different rates without having any cracking or splitting or anything like that. But once that's all said and done, here I am just cutting off that additional little end on the breadboard. So now I'm just doing the routering, and I'm just smoothing over the edge a little bit. Now, being that it is a distressed top, I just wanted to take that router just to make it a good starting reference point. So again, I'm just taking that angle grinder with the wire wheel, and I'm just going over it and sort of making it uneven and just making it look like the table's been sitting in this person's dining nook for many years. But yeah, just using the sander and just starting at 120 grit, and eventually I go to 180 grit, and that's the final grit. So now I'm just applying the stain now, and for this particular customer, she did do a custom match, and it's sort of a two-part staining process. I start off with a pickling, and what that does is that'll just keep the yellowing of the wood down, because she does have quite a modern interior, so she didn't want it to have the wood all yellowed. So after I do that, I just come in after the fact with a rag, and I'm really taking off as much white as possible, because again, we're not looking for a pickling, but we're looking more for that keeping the white down. So after that's said and done, I came in with the second part of the stain. Now this was a custom match, and when I was applying it, I was actually a little bit worried because it's got a bit of a green tinge, and I was like, oh dear, I hope this is going to look good. But the end result is once it was dried and I sprayed on a coating of the water-based finish, the table just turned out fantastic. And here it is in the customer's home, and they were super happy. But that's the end of the video. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. We'll see you on the next video. Bye.